Hello class. I'm hoping this video won't take too long, but I do want to go over scenes 2 and 3 with you to be sure that we're all on track with Romeo and Juliet, and I want to preview a little bit of scenes 4 and 5 as you get ready to finish reading Act 1. I'm playing a little music in the background, which is the theme from Romeo and Juliet, the ballet by Tchaikovsky. So maybe that'll keep this from being too monotonous, have a little music in the background. Probably the best thing for you to do, if you haven't already, is to get your Romeo and Juliet book as well as your um, guide and questions that you answered for Act 1, Scenes 2 and 3, so that we can be looking at the same material at the same time. To your homework email, I will be attaching my notes that I wrote as I was reading scenes 2 and 3 so that you can also have those to help you as you prepare for the quiz we'll be taking soon and help you to understand better what's happening in the story. So let's get our books out. I'm going to put my glasses on. I'm looking at scene 2 on page 29 of your book. And as this scene opens, the first thing we see is that Father Capulet is talking to Paris, who is a suitor of Juliet's. And one of the things, I'm going to turn the music down a little bit. One of the things that we notice right away is there's a similarity between Paris and Juliet. I mean, Paris and Romeo. Both of them are wanting to marry quickly. Now, at this stage in this play, Romeo is still in love with Rosalind, but Paris is in love with Juliet. And both Romeo and Paris want to marry their loves quickly. So there's a similarity between the two. And I think that you'll see that Romeo has some kindness for Paris and some understanding. They are kindred spirits, I guess you could say, in a way. They understand each other, and you'll see that as we get towards the end of this play. So as you're looking here at scene 2, we see Capulet talk about how old Juliet is. It says she is not even 14 years old yet, so she's not quite 14, which means she's 13. Um, and her father says he wants her to be 16 before she gets married. Now, when some people read Romeo and Juliet, they make an assumption that because this was written a long time ago, that perhaps girls got married at 13, 14, 15, and 16. Perhaps that was common. But historically speaking, it was not common for girls this age to be marrying. It is much more likely for girls during this time period to have married around 27. And the average age right now is 28, so it's pretty close. The exception to that was when the families that were marrying their children were wealthy. And in that case, they often married young because they were increasing the family's prominence in the city and making their hold on their money tighter and more difficult to break apart. And they were looking at benefits not just for the children that were marrying, but for both families. So sometimes it happened in moneyed families, and that's what we see here with the Capulets and with Paris, the suitor, is that there is money involved and it benefits both families. So that's why they're looking at such a young age. And the same way Capulet is saying, don't, be trying to decide all this too fast because I really would like to wait 2 more years, I think. And he tells Paris to go to the party tonight. There'll be a lot of pretty girls there. And that's something that we're hearing Romeo's friends tell him too, is that don't be so stuck on Rosalind. Go to the party tonight and you'll see that there are lots of beautiful women that can be chosen from. So Capulet's saying that now, here at the beginning of scene 2, but we have to wonder, does he really mean it? Because he doesn't tell Paris to go away. He just says, let's wait a little bit. But you'll see soon, as we continue through here, that they really don't want to wait. They really do want Juliet to marry quickly to Paris. Then when you look at page 31, I'll turn the music down again. When you look at page 31, you'll see that now we have Benvolio and Romeo who have entered into the scene. And again, Benvolio, who is Romeo's good friend, is trying to help him cheer up a little bit. And so he's telling him that the current pain of his unrequited love will go away with the pain of new love. He's saying, you're going to fall in love again, and then you will go through all of this angst again, and then this new love will make you forget the old love. But Romeo, of course, he's still, moaning and groaning and being all melancholy, and he doesn't really want to be cheered up. As we continue on page 33, you'll see at the bottom of that page, Benvolio is telling Romeo the same thing that Capulet told Paris, is go to the party, and you'll see that Rosalind, and you can compare her to the other girls there, which is not a very nice thing to be saying, but they are Romeo's friends, and they are trying to help him, and Rosalind has turned him down, so there's no need for him to have his hopes up for her at all. But on page 35, you'll see Romeo continues to talk, and he says that he thinks a more beautiful lady is impossible. That there could be none such as Rosalind, and there will be no other. And then as we get to the end here of this scene, it says, Romeo says, I'll go along, but no such sight will I be shown. Instead, I will rejoice in my own beloved Rosalind. Now, at this point, because the chorus talked to us in the prologue, we already know that Romeo is going to see Juliet at the party, and there's going to be no thoughts of Rosalind left in, sorry, my phone's ringing. No thoughts of Rosalind left in his mind. So this is, even though Romeo thinks that it'll be Rosalind that his heart rejoices in, we know his heart's going to rejoice, but it won't be Rosalind. So this is a type of foreshadowing. It's also something known as dramatic irony. Dramatic irony is when those who are watching a play or reading a book know something that the characters in the play don't know. And so Romeo here is saying, I will rejoice in my own beloved Rosalind, but we all already know it won't be Rosalind. So that's called dramatic irony, as well as we have a little foreshadowing here that his heart is going to be rejoicing. As we look at scene 3, I'm on page 37, you'll see this is a little bit of kind of home dialogue, something that's going on between Juliet and her mother and the nurse. And the purpose of this scene is to let you know that Juliet has kind of a formal and somewhat stiff relationship with her mother, yet she has a very close and loving relationship with the nurse. It's different than what you would expect. And so this scene helps to set that, because the nurse is going to be an important part in this story. She'll have her part to play. And it needs to be set up so you're prepared for the nurse to do the things that she does and be willing to do what she does for Juliet and for Romeo and why she does it. And so this scene helps you to understand the why behind all of that. So as we look here, if you look just a few lines down, Juliet's mother has called her, and Juliet answers, Madam, I am here. What is your will? And that's very formal language, even for Shakespeare, especially between a mother and a daughter. And so that lets you know right away that their relationship is less mother-daughter and more just almost someone who's in charge and someone who's following directions. We have a little bit of humor right here. In the very next line, Lady Capulet says, This is the matter. Nurse, leave us. So she tells the nurse to leave her, and then only like 6 words later, she says, we must talk in secret. And then she goes, Nurse, come back again. I have remembered you hear our counsel. You know everything anyway, so you should probably stay. So I'm watching my cat. She wants to come over and talk to you guys. He put her down. So so that's kind of funny how that happens, and it also shows how Nurse is really an integral part of this little family. The nurse goes on to, they're talking about the age of Juliet. The mother comes in and is talking about how old she is, and the nurse is saying, I know how old she is. I know how old she is to the minute. Um, all mothers know when their children were born. I can tell you the times both of my daughter and my son were born. So those who love their children, either their own or those that they care for, they know those things. And so the nurse is saying she knows exactly when Juliet was born to the hour. And she also here she talks a little bit about her daughter Susan, and evidently Susan and Juliet were close in age, but Susan died still as an infant, and so that's probably part of why Nurse loves Juliet so is because she kind of took the place of her own daughter who had passed away. On page 39, there's a little story here that Nurse is telling. It's a story of Juliet when she was a baby. The nurse and her husband, who has also now passed away, were taking care of Juliet. Juliet was just beginning to walk, and she fell and hit her forehead. And nurse is telling the story that she had a little cut, and that she remembers her husband laughing with her and saying, "Oh, it's because you're so young. When you get older, you'll learn to fall backwards instead of forwards." And they thought that was so funny. And so it's a real happy memory that Nurse has with Juliet, whom she loves, and her husband, whom she misses. And so this kind of tells you of that sweet relationship that the two of them share. It also reminds us, as we're watching or reading the play, that Juliet is a real person who was a baby at some time. And sometimes we forget that whenever we're talking to people, especially like if you're thinking about your parents. It's hard to think about them that they were babies one time that someone cared for and took and watched over and have sweet stories to tell about. But so this brings us closer to Juliet too, and helping her see her as a real person, not just a character in a play. So, but you see, you kind of get an idea again of that relationship between Juliet and her mother because right after Nurse tells this sweet story, instead of the mom going, "Oh, that's so sweet. I love that story." Instead, she says, "Enough of this." She doesn't want to talk about the sweet stories. I can tell you as a mother that when I tell stories of my children, I love doing that. And even if they're tired of it, I could hear it again and again and tell it again and again. And if my husband's telling it, I'm happy to listen to it again. I would never say, enough of that. I don't want to hear any more stories. So that tells you a little bit about that relationship. And then after Lady Capulet says that, it's almost like Nurse is kind of muttering under her breath and she's telling the story again. She's she just wants to remember it again. It was a happy time. And so she repeats that story one more time. Um, so finally Juliet says, "Okay, nurse, that's enough. Stop." And and the nurse does. So it tells you that the nurse listens to Juliet better than she listens to her mother. Um, Also on page 41, which is where I am now, Juliet's mother is telling her that she has a suitor and his name is Paris. And evidently Paris is a very eligible bachelor in their city. And so she's telling Juliet that Paris is very handsome, he's very eligible, she's a lucky girl that he has been looking her way. And so she asked Juliet, "Can you love him?" And then she tells this romantic story about a marriage between a woman and a man, and how the woman completes the man and helps. He may have a lot of things on his own, but without a wife, he's like a book without a cover, and that Juliet can be the cover for his book. So she makes everything sound very romantic, but you have to ask yourself, is an arranged marriage between a 13-year-old and a man she's never met, is that really romantic? And most people would say, no, arranged marriages are not necessarily romantic. And the mother's counter argument for that is everyone already loves Paris, and if you marry him, they'll love you too. So Juliet on page 43, which is where I am, she is compliant, but she's somewhat vague in her answer. She doesn't say yes or no, but she does say, I'll look at him and see if I like him. So she's agreeable, but not committing to anything. And as we finish up this scene, it's important to be remembering that her mother reminds her of her duty, while the nurse reminds Juliet that she should seek happiness. So even though this scene feels like it's not doesn't really advance the story of Romeo and Juliet, this scene lays a lot of groundwork for the relationship between Nurse and Juliet, the relationship between she and her mother, and um, and will help you understand things later. Um, as for questions, I'm looking at your question sheet. I think I've talked pretty much about all of those things. We're probably going to try to go over this sheet in class next week because we didn't get to talk about it because I'd like to hear some of your thoughts too. So I think I've pretty much covered all of that. So I do want to talk about scenes 4 and 5 before I put away this video. So I am watching the time. I see we're at 16 minutes, but I'm going to try to finish up before we hit the 20 mark. Um, in Acts 4 and 5, we're finishing up. In scenes 4 and 5, we're finishing up Act 1. And so in this scene, we're heading, 4 and 5, we're heading back to Romeo. So it's kind of like when you're watching a movie and they keep cutting from one scene to the next and the settings are changing. So that's what's happening. So we were with Juliet, her mother, and the nurse in Juliet's room. And we are now scene 4 with Romeo and Benvolio and Mercutio, and we're down in the street again. So as they're getting ready to crash the party, they're going to go to the Capulet party, and they weren't invited. Remember, there's this big feud going on. So as they're preparing to do that, um, Benvolio is coming across very practical and cautious. um, Mercutio, as you know, is not practical and cautious at all, and he's just all about the fun. And Romeo is all melancholy. Benvolio is the voice of reason in this trio of young men. So he's being practical and cautious. Romeo's being melancholy, and Mercutio is very lighthearted. He's just being funny. Romeo's depressed. And you'll see every answer that Romeo has always is a big downer. Everything anybody else says that tries to cheer him up, Romeo just poo-poos on it and and um, and goes back to his depression. He's enjoying being depressed. You probably have known people maybe like this sometimes when you kind of enjoy being sad and kind of getting the attention. And that's kind of where Romeo is right now. He's enjoying feeling all that angst of love. Um, One of the things that you should be looking for as you read about Mercutio is all of his puns and jokes. And you have to ask yourself, is he ever serious about anything? So that's going to be an important part as you're reading about Mercutio is look for when he's joking and being funny, and does he ever say anything that's not a joke? Um, I want you to look at page 49. On page 49, you'll see that Mercutio delivers what's known as the Queen Mab speech. And this is a really well-known piece, even though it's in Romeo and Juliet, and it really has nothing to do with their story. It's a piece of literature that is well known in all of classical literature. He starts telling this fairy tale about a fairy queen whose name is Queen Mab, and all these, fantasy type descriptions about this Queen Mab. And as he's telling this story, it's a dream that he's had, he says, and as he continues to tell it, it just gets all of a sudden starts getting odder and odder, and next thing you know, it's no longer whimsical, but it is scary almost. And one of the things that is important about the Queen Mab speech, while we talk about it, is because it has been alluded to in other pieces of literature. So there are several of those things. One of them is by Percy Shelley. He wrote a poem called Queen Mab. Now, it's important to know that Queen Mab was not a piece of literature or Greek mythology or anything else that Shakespeare had seen somewhere and added into his play of Romeo and Juliet. This is something that totally came out of his imagination. He made up Queen Mab. So that's why it's so unusual that other authors later on go back and write about this Queen Mab that comes from Romeo and Juliet, from this crazy dream that Mercutio is talking about. Another one is Herman Melville in the book Moby Dick talks about Queen Mab. That was published in 1851. And then Barry, who wrote Peter Pan, also has a part in the Peter Pan story about Queen Mab, Queen of the Fairies. So that's kind of interesting, this Queen Mab story. So I don't want you to think that you've got to memorize this or anything, but I do want you to familiar with the name Queen Mab and what it's talking about. So and that finishes up this act, this scene 4. Um, because as we look on page 51, you see Romeo has to kind of talk Mercutio down from this fantasy dream that he's been talking about. And then, after all of this detail that Mercutio has given about his Queen Mab dream, in the end, he says dreams don't mean anything anyway, they mean nothing. I want you to look at the last thing Romeo says on page 51. And I'm looking at my time. I see we're almost at 22. I'm almost done. Um, as you look here, you'll see that what he says is a reference to fate, which is destiny, one of our themes that we've been talking about. It says, I fear too early, for my mind worries about some consequence already fated by the stars. So even though Romeo is heading to a party, he's talking about a destiny that's been fated by the stars. And he says, shall bitterly begin this fearful time that this night's revels and end the term of despised life. That's ending life. He's talking about death. By some wicked payment of untimely death. But God is steering my course, directing my sail, and so he's talking about this idea of destiny, but he has this feeling that death may threaten him in some way. So this is also foreshadowing, because we know that at the end of this week, this is the beginning of the week, at the end of the week, death will overtake Romeo. Scene 5 is at the Capulet's house. I'm not going to go over this scene as carefully because I'm trying to finish going over the play. But in this scene, it's important that you see that this is where Romeo and Juliet first see each other. And if you'll remember, when we first were talking about Romeo back in the early scenes of Act 1, I told you that his name meant pilgrim from Rome. It is a religious name. And that as Romeo and Juliet meet and talk to each other, they use some religious allegory. They use some what you might call church words to talk about how they feel about each other. And part of that Shakespeare's doing on purpose because of Romeo's name. So you're going to see them talk that way as you're reading and the meeting about him talking about himself being a pilgrim, because remember his name is Pilgrim. He'll talk about her being at a cathedral, and he is traveling there. So as you continue to read, you'll see that there's also some playful talk between Romeo and Juliet. They're just kind of trading things that they talk to each other, trading words, just kind of a word play. And even today, when people meet each other, you'll see that. You'll see, especially when young men and young women are attracted to each other, there's a little bit of word play as they're kind of flirting with each other. Now, to you guys, it's not going to sound like flirting because of the language that here, but you have to remember that's what's going on, is Romeo and Juliet are flirting with each other. Um, And I want you to go to page 63, and you see Juliet. She has fallen for Romeo. She says, "Go ask his name. If he is married, my grave is likely to be my wedding bed." And what she's saying is, if he's married, I'll just die. Um, and then again, she makes a reference to fate here at the end of this scene. She says, "Sprung from my only hate is my only love." She realizes that he's a Montague, too early seen and known too late. She saw him and fell in love with him and found out who he was too late. The falling had already happened. My birth is so fickle that I must love a loathed enemy. She can't believe that of all the people she could have fallen in love with at her party, she picked the one who was an enemy to her family. And so she here is also referencing fate in that how has this happened? It must have been my destiny. And that finishes up Act 1. So hopefully that'll help you as you go to read. I did my best to keep it short, so we are under 30 minutes. Yay! So I hope you haven't had too hard of a time listening, and I will see you in class next week. Bye.